Section 4.2 Understanding Standard Deviation. 4.2 Alternative Risk Measures. When assessing risk in investment portfolios or analyzing non-normal data distributions, alternative risk measures can provide valuable insights beyond standard deviation. Here are three commonly used alternative risk measures. Downside risk. Downside risk focuses on measuring the potential losses or negative deviations below a specified threshold, typically the minimum acceptable return or the risk-free rate. It provides a measure of the downside volatility or the risk of incurring losses. Common downside risk measures include the semi-deviation and the downside deviation. Semi-deviation. Semi-deviation calculates the standard deviation of only the negative return observations, measuring the dispersion of returns below the threshold. It quantifies the volatility of the downside and provides a measure of the risk of losses. Downside deviation. Downside deviation extends the concept of semi-deviation by considering a specified target return or threshold. It calculates the standard deviation of returns below the threshold, providing a measure of risk specific to returns falling below that level. Semivariance. Semivariance is another alternative risk measure that focuses solely on the negative deviations from the mean, similar to downside risk. It measures the dispersion or variability of returns below the mean or a specified target return. Semivariance assigns greater weight to downside movements and provides a measure of risk specific to negative returns. Semivariance is particularly useful when the investor is primarily concerned with minimizing losses or when the distribution of returns is asymmetric or exhibits skewness. Value at risk. VAR. Value at risk is a widely used risk measure that quantifies the maximum potential loss at a specified confidence level over a given time horizon. VAR estimates the amount of loss that an investment or portfolio might suffer under normal market conditions. It provides a measure of downside risk and helps investors understand the potential worst-case scenarios. VAR is expressed as a dollar amount or percentage and specifies the maximum potential loss that might occur over a defined time period with a certain confidence level, e.g., 95% VAR over 1 day. VAR considers the entire distribution of returns, including extreme events, and is not limited to assuming a normal distribution. Each of these alternative risk measures provides unique insights into risk assessment and helps investors understand the potential downside risks associated with their investments. When used in combination with standard deviation, they provide a more comprehensive view of the risks involved and assist in making informed investment decisions. It's important to note that alternative risk measures have their own limitations and assumptions. It's advisable to carefully choose the appropriate risk measure based on the characteristics of the data, the investment objectives, and the specific context of the analysis. Let's compare and contrast alternative risk measures, including downside risk, semivariance, and value at risk, VAR, with the traditional measure of risk, standard deviation. Standard deviation. Standard deviation measures the overall volatility or dispersion of a data set. It considers both positive and negative deviations from the mean and provides a measure of the total variability in returns. Standard deviation assumes a symmetric distribution, such as the normal distribution, and is widely used as a measure of risk. Comparison. Standard deviation considers the entire distribution of returns, both positive and negative. It provides a measure of total variability and is sensitive to both upside and downside movements. Standard deviation is straightforward to calculate and widely understood. Contrast. Standard deviation treats upside and downside deviation symmetrically, even though investors typically have more concern about downside risk. It does not specifically focus on negative returns or capture the potential losses in the tail of the distribution. Standard deviation assumes a normal distribution, which may not hold true for many real-world data sets. Downside risk. Downside risk measures focus on capturing the risk associated with negative returns or losses. They provide a measure of the volatility or dispersion of returns below a specified threshold. Comparison. Downside risk measures, such as semi-deviation and downside deviation, specifically consider negative deviations from a threshold, typically the minimum acceptable return. They provide insights into the downside volatility and the risk of incurring losses. Downside risk measures are particularly useful when investors are primarily concerned with protecting against downside risk. Contrast. Standard deviation considers both positive and negative deviations, while downside risk measures focus solely on negative deviations. downside risk measures do not provide a comprehensive measure of overall variability or dispersion. Semivariance. Semivariance is a risk measure that concentrates solely on negative deviations from the mean or a specified target return. It measures the dispersion or variability of returns below the mean or a threshold. Comparison. Semivariance, like downside risk measures, focuses on capturing downside risk and the potential for losses. It assigns greater weight to negative deviations, reflecting the investor's emphasis on avoiding losses. Contrast, standard deviation considers both positive and negative deviations. Whereas semivariance focuses only on negative deviations, semivariance does not provide a measure of overall variability or capture upside potential. Value at risk, VAR. VAR is a risk measure that quantifies the maximum potential loss at a specified confidence level over a given time horizon. It estimates the potential loss beyond a specified threshold for a given level of confidence. Comparison. VAR provides a measure of downside risk by focusing on the worst-case scenarios and tail events. It considers the entire distribution of returns and incorporates extreme events, making it suitable for capturing potential losses in the tail of the distribution. Contrast. Standard deviation measures overall volatility, whereas VAR provides a specific dollar amount or percentage estimate of potential losses at a given confidence level. VAR focuses on the extreme tail of the distribution, while standard deviation considers the entire distribution. VAR provides a measure of risk specific to a confidence level, whereas standard deviation does not provide a direct quantification of potential losses. In summary, alternative risk measures like downside risk, semivariance, and VAR provide complementary insights to standard deviation. They specifically address downside risk, potential losses, and extreme events. While standard deviation captures overall variability, these alternative measures provide a more focused assessment of risk, particularly in situations where downside risk is a primary concern. Investors should consider using a combination of these measures to gain a more comprehensive understanding of risk in their investment analysis.